Epilogue Chapter 4. Not here, Song firmly said. The watchwoman at the desk was leaning in, eyes bright at the prospect of gossip. Miriam would not have minded airing out Tredegar's dirty little secrets, but it was not worth the fight with Song. There was nothing to gain there save the joy of spite. Up the stairs they went, to a stone hallway with burnt orange carpets. She was charmed to notice little hopping rabbits were hidden in the patterns, frolicking about merrily. There were numbered doors alternating on each side of the hall and stairs leading up at the left end. It never failed to impress Miriam how skilled Morneric, the sailing peoples, were at building upwards. It must be because there were so very many of them in such small spaces, she mused. Their room was at the right end of the hall, opposite the stairs. Number 27, though there could not be that many rooms in the hostel. Some kind of local superstition? Tristan unlocked the door, and Miriam was amused to realize she had never noticed him taking one of the keys. Not that he would need it if he truly wanted to enter a room. He'd shown her his kit on the fair vistas. Between the lockpicks and the skeleton key there was not much short of an etherlock that would ward him off. The last in, Miriam closed the door behind her. Their room was spacious and clean, 6 beds, 2 rows of 3 against either wall, and for each row a dresser and wash basin. There was a wooden trunk at the end of every bed, a key laid atop it, and facing the street was a broad double window with open shutters. Orrery lights filtered in, coming to rest on a small writing desk stocked with ink and paper, and 4 unlit oil lamps hung from long iron rods nailed into the walls. Miriam's gaze lingered on the slice of silver light lingering atop the writing desk, sending out her nav to taste it. To her spirit effigy the other felt clandestine. A light for thieves and secrets, for ambushes. Every false star of the grand aura carried a will, and order, as if no 2 ancients had been able to agree on what it was they were building. Shaking off the thought, and Tristan's curious look, she slid her pack off her shoulder and let it slump to the ground. Gods, but she was tired. Her every limb ached. Yet Miriam barely had a moment to roll her aching shoulders before Song turned to Tredegar. "Kindly elaborate," the Tianxi said. "What trouble are we in?" Miriam marked. Song was all too eager to drag them all into the Milani's entanglements. Tristan picked a bed by the windows, abandoning his pack on the floor and dropping down on the sheets. Miriam snatched up her bag and sat on the bed by his, keeping an eye on Tredegar, who was clearing her throat in embarrassment. "I have been invited to an evening of light refreshments," Angharad said. "A grave peril indeed," Tristan opined. Miriam swallowed a grin. Ever quick to bite, her viper. "Full retreat, every woman for herself," she tacked on without missing a beat. The Milani, Miriam would not refer to her as Perdiri in her thoughts so long as the girl called her Triglav, for she was Isvrika and Triglav was a word whose meaning spanned a dozen peoples, narrowed her eyes at them. Stiff-backed, Tredegar passed her invitation to Songkstinghand and the Tianxi studied it while the noblewoman deigned to explain her meaning to the rest of them. "One those who invited me is a noble bearing a Milani name," Tredegar said. "I have reason to suspect they would be a foe to me." Milani were dogs eating their own children, who were they not foes too? They would steal the lights from firmament itself to bejewel their High Queen's crown, if they but had the reach. All eyes were on Tredegar, even Tristan bothering to sit up on his bed, but now the Milani hesitated. No blabbermouth when it came to her secrets, this one. Miriam might have reluctantly approved of that, if those secrets were not likely to get them shot at. "If we are to face your enemies with you," Song gently said, "it is only reasonable for us to be told of their grudge and nature." Hand-holding, Miriam scorned. How gentle a touch this was compared to the Tianxi's talk with her on the ship. No, that was unfair, the pale-skinned woman decided after a moment. Miriam had brandished her fists first and there was no kindness in a brawl. And most damning of all, Song had read the Milani right, for she squared her jaw and got to unpacking her secrets. Miriam would argue with many things, but never victory. "I belong to House Tredegar of Lyn Hall," Tredegar said. Mere months ago, it was butchered savagely and struck from the rolls of Milani nobility by the High Queen's court. Miriam frowned. She had thought that the Duchy of Peredur had its own nobility, called peers instead of lords, but did somewhat recall hearing of Perdiri nobles taking Milani names. Perhaps it was related. I know not why, Tredegar said, jaw clenched, only that they murdered my kin and parents and spared not even our servants. It was. Angharate Tredegar breathed in, breathed out. It would not take shovel work to dig up this one's pain. The Asverika took no pleasure in her grief, but neither could she muster much pity for it. How many mothers and fathers had been butchered and bought on House Tredegar's behalf, made into meat and cattle to pay for parties and roof tiles and pretty belt buckles. It was evil, what had been done to Angharate Tredegar. But what of it, when evil had paid for the very boots she wore? I survived, Tredegar continued, tone pained, and thanks to preparations of my father and the help of an allied house I was able to flee Malin by ship. Assassins have pursued me since. A pause. The false year Etsy confessed to having been hired for my murder. That revelation came as a surprise. Tredegar had not mentioned it the night when she slew her would-be killers. Mariam looked away, surprised by a pang of sympathy. She knew a thing or two about running ahead of Milani killers, starving and lost. When she looked back to the noblewoman she found her looking away, a faint look of shame on her face. She had missed something. Sholomance will not be so easy to infiltrate as the Dominion, Song finally said. And even should a student be suborned, killing is forbidden. Abduction isn't, Tristan said. The brown-haired man was still sitting cross-legged on his sheets, but for all the apparent looseness of his stance Mariam saw how his eyes revealed it a lie. They were calm, like a clock ticking on. She would not soon forget that night out by the raised stones. The way his hands had shaken but his eyes stayed unwavering as he spoke of buying his way out of the grave. You could trust a man like that, who rode fear without letting it ride him. It was the only kind of man you could trust, really. If I had to arrange it, Tristan continued, I'd have Lady Angharate dragged onto a ship and shot in the head the moment we crossed the ring of storms. Tredegar inclined her head at him, not offended in the slightest by what someone else might have taken a threat. Unsurprising. Milani never gave their word without thinking of 10 ways to break it without staining that pile of loopholes they called honor. Still, in staring at the horizon those two had missed the pebble and the boot. Mariam cleared her throat, rising to her feet. It's not a trap, she said. Tredegar frowned even as the blue-eyed woman went to lean back against the dresser. The book downstairs, Mariam continued. The one that watchwoman got your invitation from. It had a few more invites tucked in, didn't it? It did, Song immediately agreed. After a moment Tredegar nodded in agreement. I bet if we go down and look, all of these will have different names, she said. I'd even bet that if we went to one of the other hostels, the Emerald Vaults, Song? The Tianxi inclined her head, arms folded. If we go to the Emerald Vaults, their ledger in front will have the same set of invitations wedged in, Mariam said. The hosts will have them everywhere. There's no telling where students would be sent to sleep after getting here, so the surest way to reach them is to have those letters waiting in front. Likely they invited all the noble-born students and you made a list. Then you offer a silver or two for passing word your invitation was received and you're sure to learn of it on the quick, Tristan mused. It's a sensible method. And one that needed no servants to work, just coin. Tredegar bit the inside of her cheek, looking sour. Disapproving of how close it sounded to bribery, Mariam guessed. The blast cloak did say I was lucky to arrive in time, the Milani finally acknowledged. That implies the evening has been planned for some time and there would not have been much time to scheme between receiving news of my survival on the Dominion and our arrival here. The frown deepened. But how would they know of my coming, if not through my enemies? She asked. Naive, coming from the girl whose watchman uncle had padded every blast cloak pocket on the Dominion to help her survive. No one at Sholomance would be without patrons in the watch. Even Mariam had one, though he was worlds away from the Trebian Sea and his influence accordingly thin. The same way I got on the Blue Belt, Song replied. Connections in the watch. I expect your being a mirror dancer is on your record and that will draw attention. This might well be an attempt at forming ties, or even poaching, rather than anything more nefarious. It would have been pleasant to entertain the fantasy of Tredegar being traded for another cabalist. Aliorganon or Tianxi would be best. They tended to be the most tolerable, but Maliam knew better. Song would not allow it. I'd still say you pegged it right, Tredegar, Tristan mused, stroking his beardless chin. Maybe the ones throwing the party don't want your head in a basket, but where there's one noble there's always more. If a Mullany Habarn arranged the party, there will be more in attendance, Tredegar said, fist clenching. Almost certainly. I must decline attending, then. Mariam shook her head, the gesture drawing their eyes. She eased off the dresser, which she had felt begin tipping. It is better to siege than be besieged, she quoted. If you hole up behind your walls, your enemy is left master of the land. A Triglav war manual? Song asked, sounding curious. The words of a general, Mariam said, meaning my mother. Her eyes moved to find Tredegar's. If your foe is as rich and powerful as you think, are they truly someone you can outlast? It had been a slower death, retreating to the hill holds, but still a death. Mother had seen the truth of that even as the kings spoke of ceding Zarla's drift and all of Dubrak to the Mullany, of abandoning the flat grounds where their muskets rained to bleed them across the goat paths instead. They would tire of the raids and ambushes, the king said, and either the Mornaric would leave or the old trade would resume. Only the Mullany had not tired, had not left. They had built forts, brought settlers and cannons and priests. And when the kings finally grasped the Mullany were there to stay it had been much, much too late. Tredegar blinked in surprise, but slowly nodded. There was a tension there that made Mariam uncomfortable, for it was hard to name. Fancy, Tristan drawled. Back home, we just say that the best way to know what's inside a beehive is to kick it. Mariam would have taken him at his word, if not for the sly glance he sent their captain after. That is not a Sacramontan saying, Song flatly said. A Sacramontan is saying it, Tristan said. So, you know, by the transitive property of things, that is a law of mathematics, the Tianxi interrupted, sounding baffled. How do you even know about bickering erupted, irritated on one end and gleeful the other, until it was cut right through. Tredegar had chuckled, at first, but it turned into a streak of laughter and then something deep from the belly. Mariam eyed the Mullany warily, for the sound was less mirth and more a wound being lanced. She was purging, and when the last chuckles left Tredegar she looked exhausted. All eyes stayed on her. Apologies, Tredegar said, voice hoarse. I am tired, I think. It has been a long few weeks, Mariam said, tone cautious. For all of us. She sent out her nav, feeling out the Mullany, but she felt no different from usual in the other, a mind sharp and narrow, like a blade. Tredegar nodded something like thanks, and Mariam's jaw tightened. She did not want gratitude, not for such a small gesture. It felt too much like being in the wrong. Song, who had been leaning against the wall with folded arms since the talk began, suddenly pushed off. Her face was resolute. We all have stones hanging around our necks, Song told them. It is how we ended up on the dominion of lost things in the first place. I will not pry at secrets, not even a captain can demand this, but threats that might trouble us all are a different matter. She paused, silver eyes sweeping through their cabal. Angharad has shared hers. It is time for the rest of us to do the same. Are you to start, then? Tristan idly said. Too idly, Mariam thought. It was the kind of shallow cheer pulled over anger or irritation. Tristan Abraskal had spent most of life with only firmament above his head and nothing but his feet keeping death from catching up. It would not be any time soon he stopped seeing a captain as anything but a hindrance to pay lip service to. If you would like, Song evenly replied, not rising to the bait. I am Ren. We are responsible for what the republics call the dimming. Mariam had long been fascinated by tales of Tianxia, whose luminaries sounded not unlike the work of the ancients painting the highlands in wandering light. The republics were a wealthy realm, she had read, because they lay under great mirror conduits bathing hundreds of miles of towns and fields in golden light. As there were 9 such luminaries but 10 republics, a lottery arranged which land would be left in the dark until the next draw. But in the latter half of what Mornaric called the century of sails, one of these luminaries had been broken. "Your family broken ninth of heaven, you once said to me," Angharad quietly said. Face blank as a porcelain mask, Song nodded. Keoxlang Ren, my grandfather, made the decision that brought down the three-legged tower of the Republic of Jigong and broken ninth of heaven, she continued, tone entirely without emotion. Jigong has since been condemned to the dark as punishment and will forever remain so. She swallowed. All bearing the name Ren are reviled, regardless of relation to my line, but I am of direct descent, she said. My kin had to flee Jigong, but hatred heeds no borders. My countrymen will sometimes seek to do me harm without greater reason than my name, and those of Jigong may well attempt to take my life outright. That legacy was half the reason they knew each other at all. The sheer novelty of her being warned off sitting with someone at the mess hall had been enough to ensure that Mariam would seek out the Tiangsi eating alone in a corner and being treated like she had a plague. The Azvrika had spent a week at the rookery, waiting for Captain Fillet to have the time to appraise her obscuration and decide whether her patron's recommendation would be accepted, only 3 days of which had overlapped with Song's own stay on the fortress island. It had been enough for them to strike an alliance of sorts, if only because the way the other candidates waiting at the rookery treated them made it plain they were short on potential associates. Silence hung in the wake of Song's words, the severity of her words having made this feel all too real. Tristan passed his hand through his hair and sighed. I have no knowledge of why I am being hunted, he said, which Mariam suspected was actually true. But I will say this, I am an orphan and not through happenstance. I will repay that favor tenfold to those responsible, and on that list is the name of a powerful Infanzon. That pursuit may yet bring down enmity on our heads. That was more than she had expected him to say. Wise of him to steer clear of the name of Cherden, given that Tredegar was not a fool incapable of basic addition, but sooner or later that would out. Still, by the approving look the Milani was sending him at the mention of bloody vengeance, Mariam thought if he played the conversation right he might well end up without a sword in his belly. Tredegar was not a hypocrite in ways too obvious. She would not condemn someone's revenge in the same breath she swore her own. Eyes turned to Mariam, the last of the lot, and the blue-eyed woman worried her lip. She had secrets but none that came with foes, and her ambitions would remain her own. She did, however, have a situation. I have no great enemies, save what my color will earn me, Mariam finally said. But there may be a danger closer to home. The pale woman closed her hand into a fist, the wooden fingers she had been fitted with in 3 pines creaking. Half the time she forgot she had ever lost them, then she tried to flip a coin and it was as if she was the world's worst bungler. There is something odd about my signifying, Mariam admitted. I have great facility with autarkic signs, the rarest and most difficult of the arts, but struggle with even the simplest manifestations. That is. She trailed off. There is no such thing as a safe anomaly, in signifying, she said. It is a lit fuse whose length I do not know, and if I do not find the root of the trouble there is not telling what will happen when it reaches powder. That was the first lesson of signifying, the one every navigator learned. There is no harmless way to use the gloam. You have drunk poison and it will kill you, the only question left is how long it will take. Mariam knew it had to be the unusual nature of her obscuration that was responsible for her block, but it should not have. She breathed in, stilled her mind. Now was not the time and this was not the place. She would seek out the local shelter house and with it the navigator's guidance. In time, Song spoke into the silence. I hope that we will share details of contracts and signs so that we might plan accordingly. Before anyone could add anything she raised a quelling hand. It is early days and we are yet strangers, she said. Such things should not be forced. Besides, we have a more urgent consideration. Silver Eyes moved to Tredegar. If you would reconsider attending the evening, there are opportunities there, she said. This alleged gathering at Misery Square tomorrow is meant, I feel, for the late and the desperate. The skilled will already have formed cables, and attending such a soiree will reveal who the most influential of our rivals are to be. And regarding foes, it would be best to reveal them by kicking the beehive. Tredegar lightly suggested. Tristan grinned her way, his pleasure matched by Song's chagrined look. Mariam resented the Milani's occasional wittiness, which made her harder to dislike. If you are to have enemies, it would be best to learn now and prepare to fight them, Song pragmatically said. In this I agree with Mariam, it is better to seek them out than to let them find us. That said, it would be imprudent to send you alone. Tredegar flicked the Isvarika's way, then Tristan's. A beat passed. We should bathe before attending, the Milani told Song. And see about getting a fresh uniform, at least. Mariam smiled even as Song's lips thinned. The Tianxi seemed to enjoy it a great deal less when it was her being given accidental insults. I cannot be the one to go with you, she stiffly said. My name may well be barred from entry, and if it is not, then other Tianxi might walk out in answer to my presence. More likely I will be asked to leave, and you would then stand alone. Tredegar frowned. I would be an entirely different sort of scandal, Mariam idly said. Unless, of course, you would ask me to attend as your slave. She eyed the Milani with a smile, skin-deep pleasantry, as that frown deepened. I would not, Tredegar said. Wise, she replied. So not entirely senseless. Perhaps some hope should be allocated to Song's promised efforts, though Mariam would not hold her breath. Their stare-off was interrupted by a chuckle. Why yes, Lady Tredegar, it would please me to be your escort at this evening of refreshments, Tristan drawled. You do know how to make a man feel special. Tredegar cleared her throat. Your help would be most welcome, she said. Don't worry, the gray-eyed man smiled. You'll hardly even notice I'm there. Mariam leaned his way. I could do with a spare cloak, she whispered. Try to find out if there's a pawnshop, he whispered back, and if they take silverware. What was that? Tredegar asked, eyes narrowed. He was wondering what to wear. Mariam lied without batting an eye. I am not used to the company of nobles, Tristan added, feigning shyness. It was little like watching a cat slap a bowl off her table and then pretend it had been just as surprised as you were. Let us find out what the possibilities are, then, the noblewoman said. Come, Tristan, the watchwoman downstairs should have some answers. The Sacromontan was quickly browbeaten into joining the expedition, looking back mournfully at his still-packed bag, but when he turned to glance at Mariam it was not sympathy she offered. Something with a hood, she silently mouthed. He rolled his eyes, Tredegar dragging him out shortly after, and Mariam was left to stand alone under Song's disapproving stare. Mariam. I will not apologize, she gravely said, for thriftiness. Mariam. The Isvarika raised her hands defensively. I mean, why even have a thief if we don't ask him to steal things? Song sighed. If the two of you end up in a goal, she said, I'll leave you there until classes begin. That was fair, Mariam conceded. After Mariam put away her clothes in her trunk, neatly, but not so neatly as Song's meticulous smoothing and folding of everything she owned, she stayed kneeling by the bed, eyes closed. Her limbs ached, a dull throb that somehow urged her to both move and stay still. I was thinking of having a look around the port, Song said. Would you be interested? I was thinking of napping, Mariam said. The Tianxi's brow rose. Did you not on the ship? I keep having dreams I don't remember, she admitted. And when I wake up I'm more tired than when I went to sleep. You need a meadow, Song flatly said. The rings around your eyes have been getting worse. The Tianxi wasn't right, but there were always rules around meadows. Mariam would try rest in a proper bed first and simply seek guidance from a signifier. It might be something in the local ether that was affecting her like this. It was nowhere this bad on the Dominion, Mariam said. And I am less than fond of ships, it can't have helped. A pause. I will leave you the room and the key, then, Song said. But you must tell me if your troubles persist. Mariam half-heartedly agreed, and within moments of being alone was lying on the bed. She rose only to close the shutters and then promptly buried her face in the pillow again. When she woke groaning, a trail of sweat down her back and her heart pounding with dread, she was left to wish she had taken Song's advice. She changed, wiping her face and neck clear in the wash basin first, and when she came down the stairs found it was no longer the same blast cloak at the desk. A little talking let her figure out that she had been sleeping for at least 3 hours, not that her aching body could tell. She left the key at the desk for Song when she returned, then went to take her captain's advice. The man at the desk gave her a direction for the Akeller chapter house, though it was vague and he admitted never having gone himself. It proved little trouble, for a direction was enough. Chapter houses always had tall walls, enough they stood out from the buildings around them. Miriam had to wander around for a time, looks and whispers trailing her wherever she went, but a few minutes of walk to the west and she found what she was looking for. Most chapter houses were built the same way, a fat, stout square bastion whose sole entrance was at the end of a narrow ramp reaching halfway up the wall. It made getting anything in and out difficult, but the guild cared for secrecy over practicality. The navigators had not remained the leading practitioners of gloam sorcery for 500 years by being careless with their secrets. Here the structure was granite, and all the old houses around it had been pulled down into rubble as if to forbid cover. Breathing out, Miriam set up the ramp and passed the open gates of the chapter house. There was no writing desk inside, no ledger or a list, not even ink for a quill. Instead the square room, covered in obsidian tiles of subtly varying shades, counted a bench on either side and an open door past them. There was nothing at all to stop Miriam from going right through, save for the middle-aged man sitting with crossed legs on the left bench and reading a book. Lear Gannon, she saw by the skin, and while his hair was long and wild his beard was neatly cropped. He did not look up as she entered, absent-mindedly turning a page. The man was not wearing a cloak but he had a regular's uniform, tunic and trousers and boots, and a small knife strapped at his side. No embroidered officer's stylings on the shoulders, but Miriam went still as stone when her eyes found his left hand. The signet ring on his hand was silver. The Akeller Guild had ranks, but the ones that mattered weren't the ones you got on your clothes. Your signet ring was what told you where stood, and silver meant you were a master within the Akeller Guild. No wonder the man wasn't taking guarding the entrance seriously. If he had taken the time to prepare the room with signs, he would be able to fry her mind without even bothering to look up from his book. Intrigued by what such a skilled signifier might be reading, a metaphysics study, perhaps, or some ancient book of lore, she risked a glance at the title emblazoned on the front. It was The Sunflower Lord's Lady. Miriam let out a small sigh. A romance serial. One of those cheap and tawdry ones, too, which watchmen always seemed as eager to trade as liquor and gossip. At the sound of her disappointment, the man finally looked up from the page. Miriam Kameth, he said, dark eyes knowing. Come for the meadow? She blinked in surprise. Were there really so few navigator students on the island that he would recognize her at? Fool you, Kameth. However many navigators there might be, she would be the only Isvarica. Of course he had recognized her. For the night, she agreed. The man nodded. You know the rules, the master said, eyes already back on his book. Berry fingers get only one night every 5 days. And if you are to stay over, there will be no avoiding sitting with Captain Yue this time. Miriam's brow rose. This time? The blastcloak's eyes stopped moving across the page. He looked up, face gone serious as he watched her face for something. Whatever it was, he did not seem to find it. What is my name? He asked. You never mentioned it, Miriam flatly replied. His lips thinned. I did, the master retorted. When you visited for the first time, 2 hours ago. The blue-eyed woman froze. She began, then swallowed. I was sleeping in my room. I cannot have been here. Unless, of course, the eclipse was coming early and she simply did not remember. It would be ridiculous, she had only obscured a single organ but ridiculous was not impossible, and her obscuration was unusual. The wild-haired man closed his book with a snap, rising to his feet. You need to have your obscuration assessed immediately, he said. Yue has the meadow, follow me. Miriam swallowed, mouth gone dry, and meekly nodded. The man flicked a wrist behind them, gloam running off the obsidian tiles in thick rivulets and forming into a sign hanging in the open space of the chapter house gate. Not a sign she knew, but Mariam could feel its malevolent pulsing without even calling on her nav. "Come," the man said. And before either of us forgets, he caught her eye. "My name is Baltasar Formosa. Remember it, as I will be your professor in the Akeller classes." Amanda was, against what would be the expectations of most outside these walls, exactly what the name implied, a small field of greenery with a stream running through it. Most chapter houses used flowers and herbs from the surrounding lands, and there was no true rule as to what must be within save that it must live and there must be water running through. Mariam had known some chapter houses to turn their meadows into medicinal herb gardens or to grow spices, but Captain Yue evidently preferred nature to run its course. The land here was prickly green grass and wildflowers, overgrown ferns crowding the edge of a small tinkling stream. The vines on the wall were digging into the stone, like fingers looking for weakness. The only sign of order was the small mattresses laid down on both sides of the river, their sheets neatly made and their pillows in place. Mariam allowed herself a pang of longing at the sight but mastered herself, for she might have come to rest but now the purpose had changed. Professor Baltasar had led her briskly through the cramped halls of the chapter house and was now taking her straight to a woman sitting cross-legged in the grass. Captain Yue hardly even looked 30, though it could be hard to tell with Tianxi. She was broad of shoulder but slightly built, black hair pulled in a braid on the left side of her head, and half hiding the nasty burn scars on her cheek and ear. Her black coat was open, revealing a billowy white shirt, and her boots had been carelessly tossed behind her. She breathed out, then opened curious brown eyes without needing to be told of their approach. "Baltasar," she said, voice smooth as silk. "You bring me our last errant pupil." The professor grunted. "It remains to be seen," he said. "She just told me she's never seen me before. Apparently she was sleeping in her room when I saw her earlier." Captain Yue cocked her head to the side and Mariam straightened beneath her gaze, not quite sure why she felt the need. She felt a tenseness in the air, a weight, but she did not dare send out her nav. The captain bore silver on her ring finger, she might well smother Mariam's spirit effigy without noticing. The older navigator let out a hum. "She's not possessed," Captain Yue finally said. "Have her emanations been varying on the way here?" "Stable," Professor Baltasar replied. "Then you have brought me something interesting," the Tianxi happily said. "Sit with me, Mariam. Let us find out if you have begun going mad." The tanned man leaned closer. "Try not to interest her too much," he whispered. "She is not malicious, but her curiosity can be callous." The Izvireka slowly nodded. The professor left with that warning, sparing the captain a nod which she airily dismissed. Mariam stood there a moment, awkward, before clearing her throat and sitting by the other woman as offered. Captain Yue offered her hand, which Mariam reluctantly took. Her stomach clenched. "Loosen up," the captain said. "Do not take the reins of your logos even if you do not move it." She breathed in, breathed out, and then Captain Yue's nav, the logos, navigators called it, was under her skin. It was like a cat's tongue, rough and warm, as it rose up her arm examining every inch. Up to the shoulders, then the head where she lingered long, then down the other arm and the rest of the body down to the sole of her feet. When Captain Yue finally withdrew, Mariam was left feeling raw, like an exposed nerve. "Nothing has breached containment," Captain Yue informed her. "Your brain will soon be fully obscured, so I would begin considering which organ will follow, but there is nothing that would cause a sudden onset of mania." Mariam let out a slow, relieved breath. "It is quite fascinating, seeing someone who began with their brains," the Tianxi mused. "It's not unique, of course, but that you did it before puberty without going violently insane is most impressive." The Izvireka closed her mouth, biting down on the reply that it was the tradition in the land of her birth and her mother had done the same. She had been warned not to attract this one's interest. "Your dossier mentions a block when it comes to manifestations," Captain Yue continued. "How do you do with didactics?" "I cannot get them to work at all," Mariam admitted, then defensively added, "but I have had some successes with ecumenals." The Tianxi hummed. It will be difficult to tell whether you have mangled your logos somehow or there is a mental element to your difficulties until you have begun obscuring a second organ, Yue said. Have you planned your journey in that regard? Journey, that was that the guild called it. A pretty word, but its real meaning was death. Gloam was a poison that would kill you, sooner or later, drive you mad and hollow you out. Only the ancient practitioners that had founded the Akeller Guild had discovered the process of obscuration, and it had changed everything. Simply using gloam spread the damage all over your body, slowly saturating with few external signs until a sudden onset of mania. To obscure, however, was to saturate a single part of your body with the gloam. Not only did confining it to a single organ somehow allow a signifier to concentrate much more of the gloam inside it than should be possible, it also yielded a stark improvement in manipulation capacity, and, depending on where it had been obscured, some affinity with a part of the arts. Miriam had obscured her brain, which would help her with autarkic signs. Those confined within the signifier, with an emphasis on the mind. Most navigators never obscured their brain. It was difficult, dangerous and rumored to lead to instabilities, especially if done early in one's career. And of course it was, for Miriam's teacher had never hidden from her what obscuration was, when you stripped away the mystical trappings. The controlled hollowing of a part of the body, he'd called it. We turn ourselves into darklings, piece by piece. Miriam shivered at the memory and licked her dry lips. If not a bout of mania, she said, what can explain Professor Baltasar having seen me earlier? Talamantara is sitting atop one of the largest ether wells of Vesper, Captain Yue said, sounding pleased. Odd happenings are not only likely, they are to be expected. She paused, thoughtful. Perhaps your presence caught the fancy of some entity in the ether, she said. Or it might have been a reflection of you from a different time, or even a part of your soul strengthened by lower-order entities? The captain was warming up to the subject the more she spoke, eyes alight. I cannot wait to find out, Captain Yue enthused. To think I would be so lucky as to be handed so delightful a puzzle this early in the year. Callous curiosity, Professor Baltasar had called it. Miriam's estimation of the man's judgment went up a notch. Perhaps some of the thought showed on her face, for the captain's enthusiasm was visibly pulled back. But I have held you back long enough, Captain Yue said. Pick whichever bed you will, Miriam. The meadow was open to all. Tearfully thanking the other officer, Miriam dragged herself up. She picked the bed furthest from the captain, but after that huddled onto the sheets without even taking her boots off. Head on the pillows, she felt the grass around her breathe and the water flow, the currents of the world quieted, the encroaching dark kept at bay. She was out in moments, and it was the best night of sleep she'd had in months. Epilogue Chapter 5 The watchwoman handling the ledger at the front of the Rain Sparrow hostel was named Valentina, and she helped them with the enthusiasm of someone whose hour would otherwise be ferociously boring. It turned out that one of the warehouses Angharade had noticed on Hostel Street was earmarked for student supplies, including a set of 3 fresh uniforms. You could pick up your field kit as well, but I'd wait until you spoke with your patron for that, Valentina said. They'll advise you on what else to pick up at the same time. Is there a way to learn who our patron is to be? Angharade politely asked. If there was a proper way to go about her affairs she would prefer to follow it, but in the absence of such guidance she was being left to guess. Angharade never much enjoyed guessing. Father had loved riddles, and often deplored her general dislike of them. Normally the officer who sorted you out should have sent you straight to them, Valentina mused. It probably means yours hasn't arrived at Port Elysée yet. I hear the Master of Arms is running a few days late. They could be a passenger. Tristan leaned close to the perdure, though not quite enough to touch or even for his breath be felt. Sometimes she thought him half a ghost, to so rarely let himself be felt. Is your uncle not supposed to be coming soon? He murmured. Angharade bit down on her excitement, knowing it premature. Uncle Ocean being their patron would be a grand thing indeed, but for him to have acquired the wealth he'd allegedly spent on her protection he must either be highly placed in the watch or heavily indebted. Either way, could he truly afford to spend years on this island out in the middle of nowhere? It would be a pleasant surprise, she finally replied. She did not lower her voice, as speaking privately when engaged in conversation with a third party was impolite. The noblewoman then lowered her head in thanks to Valentina. "Thank you for the advice," she said. The older woman dismissed her words with a vague gesture. "No trouble," she said. "And if you've the time, I recommend that you spend a few coppers getting your uniforms adjusted at the warehouse. There's a tailor there and it'll help with impressions if you are to dine with Free Company princelings." Tristan leaned in, like a hound with a nose to the scent. "Been hearing a lot of princelings this and that being thrown around," the man said, his Sacramonte accent suddenly gone thicker. "Don't suppose you could help a friend out as to the meaning?" Valentina eyed him amusedly. "Most don't take merkmud as a slip to flash, boy," she said, then raised an eyebrow. "What gave it away?" Had Tristan noticed something, then? Angharade was somewhat at a loss as to what it might be. "You put your ledger entries in the middle," he replied. "Like all coterie bookkeepers." "It's neater that way," Valentina said, sounding peeved. "And if you align it to the left the tianxi always get picey." Catherine, Angharade remembered, was read from right to left. She said nothing, content with staying out of Tristan's way given that he did not seem to have given offense. The watchwoman sighed. "Something to keep in mind, and well worth a warning," Valentina said. "Since you're both obviously fresh to the black, I'll let you in on the way things go. After a few decades, free companies end up one of two ways: corpses or filthy rich." Angharade frowned, for that seemed a narrow case, but in truth she could not recall ever hearing of a small free company. Only half a dozen operated in the Isles, and of those a mere two were based near the Kingdom of Milan. Those two, however, could field armies and fleets that would dwarf those of any single Isintuna. An alliance of great lords would check them, surely, and the High Queen could destroy either with a single order. Yet it could not be denied they were both powerful forces. Supposedly the continent knew smaller free companies, particularly in Eastleigh and the Sommeshware where there was always work for rooks, but even these would be at least a few hundred men strong. More soldiers than Mother had ever commanded even when leading an exploration flotilla. Any company that had the pull to send students to Sholomance will have been around for ages, and it'll have leading officers wealthy as lords, the watchwoman continued. "It's their kids they'll be sending here." Black-cloaked princelings used to having the run of private armies. Valentina leaned her chin against the palm of her hand. "I'm pretty sure the Tando boy is from the Singing Jackals, and by reputation they're a real piss-in-your-porridge kind of outfit." Angharade's brow rose, for that name she had indeed heard of. The Singing Jackals were the largest free company to take contracts in Milan, said to be headquartered at an island off the southeast of the Middle Isle. They were also, more importantly, rumored to have connections with the High Queen's court. Even if this Lord Tando did not turn out to be an enemy, he would know that House Trudiger had been struck from the rolls of nobility. A discomforting thought. They both thanked Valentina for her words and took their leave. The warehouse first, Angharade silently decided, but she could use a distraction from her worries. She turned to look on Tristan as they began to walk. "You mentioned," she said as they walked out of the hostel, "that the bookkeeper of these coteries write ledger entries in the middle of the page. Why is that?" He looked at her with that strange look of surprise he sometimes put on. It came and went at the oddest times. She had yet to figure out the reason for it. "Coteries never run a single set of books," Tristan explained. "The scriveners will fill the middle, then when they are to send the numbers up the ladder they'll copy them on the left side and cut that part of the page off." Angharade almost asked why they would not simply buy a second book to write the copy in until she recalled that these coteries were petty criminals and paper was not inexpensive. "Then what is the last third for?" she asked. It was not a long walk down the street, but it struck her as odd such an important location would be so deserted. Of the half-dozen people in black cloaks moving around Hostel Street only 2 were young enough to be students, the others likely from the local garrison. "Depends who you ask," Tristan snorted. "Bookkeepers, they'll tell you it's so there's room to put their notes and corrections in." The expectation was clear. "But," Angharade gamely said, "if you asked coterie boys, They'll tell you it's the ghost ledger, the man said. The real numbers, which the bookkeepers skim off of and hide in their notes. The noblewoman frowned. Even criminal bookkeepers should have greater integrity than that. And if not morals, then at least sense. Are coteries not brutal killers? She asked. It seems unwise to rob them. A good bookkeeper's precious enough. Coteries bosses usually let them get away with skimming if they keep it small and quiet, Tristan said. It's hard to find folk learned in numbers willing to run merc books. I do not understand, Angharad admitted. Even the poorest would attend. She realized awkwardly. Other realms did not have the Izuko, the 4 years of schooling all children of the Isles went through except if their parents secured an exemption, as mother had for her. The poor of the Sacramonte likely could not read or write the way they would in Malin, much less do arithmetic. Tristan looked intrigued. Is it true all Malani children are made to attend school, then? He asked. Sailors said as much, but I always figured they meant children from good families. Or those who could pay, at least. I was told that in the larger cities some children slip through the cracks, Angharad admitted. But the attempt is ever made. The Izuko is one of the foundations of the kingdom. Not that all such schools were the same. Some nobles donated to the red roofs raised in their lands, or paid for more roofs to be raised so they would not be as crowded. The lessons stayed largely the same, however, though if one cared for rumors it was said that in Youth school teaching children the Peace of 9 Oaths, the 7th of the 9 great works, would keep accidentally catching fire until it ceased to do so. Angharad had never read the work but father said it covered the many wars between the kingdoms that had united the Low Isle and the Middle, often painting the former as the devils of the tale. Malani books will always teach Malani lessons, he had told her. The work was said to be more flattering to the ancient kingdom of Peredur, perhaps because its many princes had warred with each other more than they ever did the rulers of the Middle Isle. Angharad shook her head, chasing off the reverie. The Isles were far away, and she would not see them again for many years. They would keep while the current matters would not. The warehouse was a stooped pile of masonry that seemed almost expected, though the inside was covered with wood paneling. The front was a long counter behind which several doors stood closed, manned by a tall Someshwari woman who was half-heartedly playing a game of patience, cards laid out in front of her. She looked up when they entered, no more pleased with them than she was with her game. What do you need? We are freshly arrived, Angharad said. We come for our uniforms. Stay here, I'll see if Sergeant Andres has the time, the watchwoman said, then narrowed her eyes at them. Don't touch my cards. Angharad cocked an eyebrow at her and nodded, saying nothing as the Someshwari yanked open one of the doors and disappeared into a dimly lit hall beyond it. Tristan, who had promised nothing, leaned over the counter to have a look at the cards. She's stuck, he reported. She is on shift, Angharad said disapprovingly. If the Someshwari was so bored, she should have found something useful to do instead of waste her time in such a manner. Card games were for evening parties, not the hours sworn to service. By the time the watchwoman returned, Tristan had distanced himself from the counter, though they still both got a suspicious glare. He'll see you, she said. Plaques. They duly handed them over, and after snorting at the number she handed them back. They were ushered into a cramped room at the back of the warehouse, full of closest in stacks where piles of black clothes of differing sizes waited in quantities that could be described as significant. Sergeant Andres turned out to be a white-haired old man with a limp, Learganon looks, accompanied by an assistant, a small girl that could not have been older than 12. Sit, Sergeant Andres wheezed. Let's get you properly attired. The old man had a leather stripe marked for measures and began with Tristan, taking notes about shoulder length and the span of his legs while sending off the girl to fetch the sizes. As soon as the Sacramontan was sent off to dressing closet, the sergeant was on her, Angharad standing patiently as he took her measures. It was a familiar feeling, though Mir, Hall's household tailor, had been half this Andres's age and much sprier. I hear that the uniforms can be adjusted for a fee, Angharad said, glancing down. Which? Sergeant Andres asked. There are 3 kinds, my girl, though I could certainly work on all three if you feel the need. It turned out that Angharad had already encountered two of the kinds of uniform without knowing it. The combination Sung and Mariam had taken to wearing on the fair vistas, tunic, undershirt, trousers and cloak, was what Sergeant Andres called the regular uniform. Most students come already owning such a set, or even a few, the old man said. If that is not the case for you, they can be bought here at a discounted price. She nodded, grateful for the information, and got a frown in reply. Did your patron not inform you of this? I am told they might not have arrived on Talamantere yet, Angharad said. Sergeant Andres tsked disapprovingly. You're not getting someone from the garrison, then, he said. Unlucky you, though given that number on your plague you asked for it. Angharad did not roll her eyes at the Lierganan superstition, but it was a near thing. The sergeant kept talking as Tristan returned and was measured again, explaining how the combat uniform, the fighting fit, he called it, had a similar foundation to the regular but wore over the tunic a knee-length overcoat of impressive thickness and collared cloak. Sergeant Mendissa had worn that same kind of coat back at the old fort, Angharad recalled. Once she and Tristan had both been fitted for such a uniform, the old man measured them for the formal kind. It is rather decorative, Sergeant Andres said. Unsuited to exercise. They'll only have you put it on for a few ceremonies a year, so if you take proper care of it you might not need a second for your time at Cholomance. The centerpiece of the formal uniform was a collared long-sleeved black jacket, buttoned in silver and reaching halfway down Angharad's thighs. It sat tightly over a pale shirt, belted at the hip, pulling tight at her belly with a silver buckle. She'd had her pick of color for the stripes going down the side of her baggy trousers, choosing green, but the stiff, polished black boots they were tucked into were not negotiable. The old man offered her additions for it. A fitted capelet is most common, he said. Though the ornamental pauldron is popular, and cloth wreaths for the leg have been in some demand, matching your stripe, of course. He casually added that these would have to be bought with personal coin or brigade funds, which was when Angharad frozen. She realized, all too late, that she did not actually have any coin on her, not that she had any left, and had not formally requested Sung's permission to draw on brigade funds. In truth she was not even sure that such a thing could even be done instead of withdrawing brigade coin from wherever it was held. Shuffling away from the old man awkwardly, she cleared her throat as she saw Tristan pack away his formal uniform. Did he not intend to wear it? It was certainly her choice for the evening. I know that look, the gray-eyed man said, leaning in. Is it about a dead body or alone? Angharad cleared her throat again. Why would she need help with a dead body? Presumably, she would have been the one to make it, making any need for aid well past. It occurs to me I have no funds on my person, she reluctantly admitted. I was wondering if perhaps. Loan it is, Tristan said. I'll cover you for the fitting, but I doubt I have enough at hand for that fancy pauldron you were eyeing. Disappointing, Angharad would admit to herself. It was most striking and would have added a certain flair to her jacket. Still, she would not complain of a favor being done to her. Thank you, she said. Shall we agree on the rate? The man coughed into his hand, as if choking. I am not going to charge you interest on a couple of coppers, Angharad, Tristan said. He seemed somewhat appalled. I'm not a, he began, then smoothly changed tack halfway through the sentence, well, I'm not that kind of thief. The reminder of his past crimes was unfortunate, though his honesty was praiseworthy. You do me honor, Angharad stiffly said. I'd you for the price of a couple unripe tomatoes on Cato Street, he replied, tone dry. Let us not get too excited here. He seemed unaware of that statement he was making by refraining from a rate, that he considered her honorable enough to put a debt above all other considerations and repay it as promptly as she could. An honor reserved for only long-standing friends among nobles. A heavy compliment, and one whose severity made her uneasy. She had not considered them so close, though by accepting she would state it was so. On the other hand, by refusing she would insult them both, which was no better. That Tristan must be entirely unaware of how neatly he had trapped her only made it worse. It was like being beaten at tabula by someone unaware they could capture your pieces. "Thank you for the loan," Angharad forced out. He was of her cabal, she would have needed to learn to treat him as trusted comrade regardless. This was merely another reason to do so, not some skilled maneuver she had fallen to. With funds secured, she had her formal uniform adjusted by the old watchman, who used her as a lesson for the girl that might be as much an apprentice as an assistant. Tristan declined to have one of his own tailored, to her surprise. He was skinnier than most clothes his size would account for. Sergeant Andres did quality work and at an impressive pace. Angharad was much satisfied with the way her shoulders were let out and the trousers better fitted to her legs. As they were done with time to spare before the evening began, their next destination was all the more obvious. The bathhouse was on the right end of Hostel Street, which Sergeant Arturo had earlier mentioned. There were separate public baths for men and women, but Angharad was also pleased to find there were bronze bathtubs in private alcoves. Tristan did not resist the suggestion of a wash, or when she strongly suggested he comb his hair. "A doomed effort, but I shall make a valiant attempt," Tristan assured her with a grin. Angharad went back and forth carrying a bucket to fill her own bathtub with near-boiling water from a great tub, rejoicing at the thought of a proper bath after all this time at sea. The heat and humidity of the room were oppressive at first, but she grew used to it after settling in for a soak with a jar of fragrant oils, lavender and jasmine, for her hair and a sweet-smelling soap. A pleasant surprise, that latter part, though she supposed it sensible that good Trebian soap would be cheaper when dwelling within the Trebian Sea. Though she could not spare the time to truly luxuriate, Angharad left her bathtub feeling cleaner than she had in months. She carefully dried and braided her hair, in a simple way, though she would ask Song help for a more elaborated do on the morrow, and then tried on her new formal uniform. Eyeing herself in the mirror of the bathhouse changing room, Angharad decided it would do. The fit was still a little tight around her shoulders, but that was on purpose. The cut made her seem curvier than she truly was, but was not uncomfortable and left room for bindings. Satisfied she was presentable, she belted her saber and doubled back to the front hall. Tristan was waiting there for her, leaning against the wall in his own fresh clothes. The fighting fit for him. She would have thought that unwise were she not looking at it, but in true thickness of the overcoat made him look bulkier while allowing the wrinkles in the cloth to seem intended. In a formal uniform he would have looked like a skinny rat, Angharad mused, but under the overcoat and collared black cloak he looked like a true man of the watch. "Shall we?" the Sacramontan asked. She nodded. It would not do to be late. They returned to the Rain Sparrow hostel to put away their dirty clothes and those unused, but Song had left a message for them with Valentina. Miriam was asleep, she wrote, and so she asked for them to leave their affairs in a storage instead. Song herself volunteered to bring their property up to the room when she returned from her exploration of Portalazzi. It was inconvenient, but Angharad decided not to be allowed and conceded the matter. Besides, Song had left another line and a half at the bottom of the paper. "Learn what you can about the other cabrals," she instructed. "Look for potential allies. If you cannot make friends, then make an impression." Angharad slowly nodded to herself. This she could do. It was not so different from Mother telling her to be friendly with the daughters and sons of houses she wanted to be on fair terms with. Tristan had already put away his affairs when she emerged from her thoughts, waiting for her outside. "I asked around about where this old playhouse is when you were still in the baths," Tristan told her out in the street. "It is only a few minutes of walk from here, I broadly know the way." "Then lead on, Tristan," Angharad said, pulling at her collar. It felt tight, but not as tight as the coil in her stomach. The walk took longer than anticipated, largely because they took their time to look around. And why not? It was yet early and this was their first look at Portalazzi. Angharad found the street strangely broad, as if this were a city made only of avenues, but soon realized that the neighborhood around the docks was much different from the rest of the city. It was maintained and inhabited, seemingly full of barracks and warehouses and shops. Further out, revealed by stripes of light in red and gold, she saw how Portalazzi crumbled into ruin. Collapsed walls, trees piercing through broken roofs and vines so thick they covered the cobblestone streets like a carpet. "A dead city," she said. "But still used," Tristan replied. "There are paths through the ruins kept carefully open. The watch runs patrols here." "What against?" Angharad wondered. "That," he mused, "is the question, isn't it? The old playhouse was near the edge of that ring of inhabited city, enough that beyond it were a handful of collapsed shrines whose debris made the streets unusable. From a distance the structure looked like nothing more than a sloping stone hill split by sets of stairs, though lights and drifting sounds made it clear that it was the right place. The pair hurried up the side of the hill, and once they reached the crest, at the apex of the stairs, their steps stuttered. "I expected something like a Liergan playhouse," Tristan said. "So had I," Angharad admitted. "This is different." Even as far as the Isles, the Second Empire had built a few of their famous playhouses, those massive half-circles of stone benches leading down to a raised stripe of marble where the actors played out their roles. Angharad had not gone to the capital as part of the dueling circuit, so she never saw Alvaron's eye, but she had gone to Killardy in the southwest, and there the Lierganan had built an impressive edifice that still stood strong centuries after the last stone was laid. The old playhouse was nothing like what she had seen in Killardy. It did not rise but instead descend, at least in a manner of speaking. Ancient artisans had taken what must have been a low but wide hill and carved the outside, the great length of stone covered with now faded reliefs and strange symbols. 3 sets of stairs rose up the slope, wide and pristine, and at the summit of the hill was where the road veered off. The inside had been hollowed out. 3 concentric rings of lodges, the largest being the highest, filled the inside, almost like tiers. At the very bottom one last ring, a circle on the floor, must be the stage for the playhouse. Once upon a time the lodges were meant to be separate, for between them stood small walls topped by flat roofs of delicate ironwork made to look like vines, but nature had since decided otherwise. Grass emerged from cracked tiles, trees had overtaken walls, and vines bearing fragrant flowers covered everything like a tapestry. The 3 rings looked like long gardens full of little nooks, and indeed were being treated as if they were. On the bottom floor a handful of cloth pavilions had been raised and tables set beneath them, laden with glasses and small plates of colorful bites. The tables were attended by a few servants in plain clothes, but the true draw to the eye was the guests, every last one in watch blacks, but each uniform tailored and subtly different. There must have been 30 of them, none looking older than Angharad by more than a year or 2. They chatted and laughed by the pavilions, though some seemed to be taking pleasant walks around the lowest ring of lodges. It looked, Angharad thought, like a garden party. The same kind she had attended for much of her life, though the guests were admittedly more varied. "There's Tianxi down there, so it cannot be a strictly noble gathering," Tristan noted. "And going by looks, no one nation is leading the pack. Odd, that. This should be someone's game." Angharad's gaze narrowed. "It isn't. Have you ever worn a tailored uniform, Tristan?" "I've never worn a tailored anything," he amusedly replied, "unless you count my stitching rips back together." "Truly, not even a shirt? How expensive could it possibly be to have a shirt tailored?" the Perdiri wondered. "Getting it fitted to you does not take long, not even work more elaborate than what the tailor did earlier," she told him. "Yet a simple fitted of uniform is not what they are wearing down there. I see at least half a dozen different styles. See the man with the silk half-cape, or that girl with the layered sleeves. That sort of thing takes time, a skilled artisan and coin." Gray eyes narrowed. "Fashion," he said. "You mean this is Blastcloak fashion?" In a way, that was a relief. It meant that when Angharad saved up enough coin to acquire finer clothes, there would be shops suited to her need. The notion of the children of mere military officers being a sort of watch nobility seemed odd, but it was also logical in a way. The rooks could not recruit their captains entirely from foreign nobility, it was natural they should rear up their own. "Come," she enthusiastically said. "Let us find out more." This was an event arranged on school grounds, not a proper reception, so Angharad did not feel slighted that no servant was waiting for them as they began the trek down. The pair wended through the garden paths of the first 2 rings, going round and round, until they came across a small pavilion at the beginning of the 3rd, where waited a smilingly Ugandan man in a neat but plain tunic. He was holding a small book and a sharpened length of charcoal. "Good evening," the servant said, his Antigua smooth to the ear. "Might I assume that one of you comes bearing an invitation?" "I do," Angharade said, producing the letter. She passed it to Tristan, who passed it to the man without batting an eye. The servant inspected it for a moment, then inclined his head. "Lady Angharade Trudiger and Tristan of Brascal," he completed. 13th Brigade for both. The wince on the servant's face at the mention of the number was gone so quickly she almost thought she had imagined it. "Master of Brascal," the man completed. "I welcome you on behalf of Lord Hando and Captain Annettle, who arranged this small get-together." He paused, allowing time for them to nod their thanks. "Please enjoy and mingle with the guests as you please," the smiling man continued. "There will be a small speech at the close of the evening, but no other demands will be made on your time. This is an informal event." The servant moved out of the way, inviting them to proceed through the ring garden, and Angharade put a spring to her step. Tristan followed, but she felt him glance back after a moment, letting out an interested noise. She cocked a questioning eyebrow. "He's writing in that little book of his," the Sacramontan said. "Too much for it to simply be our names and brigade. I'd give it good odds he is some kind of sniffer taking a look at everyone come through for our benevolent hosts. He could simply be jotting down our arms and bearing," Angharade said, a touch reproachfully. The man flicked a glance her way. "Could be," he agreeably replied. Tristan was hiding his doubt skillfully enough. It would have been unfair to be miffed at him. Very unfair. It was purely accidental when the overgrown roots of a tree forced Angharade to cut ahead and her saber's sheath slapped against his leg. He yelped, rolling his eyes at her most insolently, but then his face turned serious. "We are getting close to strolling guests," he said. "I expect that at an evening like this I'd be a stone around your neck, so I'll make myself scarce." Angharade stiffened, back going ramrod straight. "You are my guest, and neither unmannerly nor foolish," she said. "None can honorably object to your presence at my side." "I think that might be the nicest compliment someone has paid me in years," Tristan amusedly replied. "But there's no need to feel as if you were abandoning me, Trudiger. I'm here to watch your back and look into things, both of which will be easier if you are not holding my hand." Angharade almost contested the matter, but she knew it would be guilt speaking if she did. Guilt at having felt a silver of gratification at the prospect of being able to enjoy herself with peers for an evening without the need to shepherd a low-born man through high society. It was not desertion, she told herself, if to separate served their purposes better. It was following a plan. "Then let us do so," Angharade said. "Shall we leave together, at least?" "Best not," Tristan said. "I might duck out early to follow the trail." She cocked her head to the side. "And what trail would that be?" "The servants handling all this," he said. "Where are they from?" That, Angharade thought, was an interesting question. No student should be allowed to bring servants, she thought, and birth would make no difference in this. Strictly speaking, Angharade had not been a titled lady since her house was struck from the rolls of nobility in Malin, but she had since given up the title anyhow by enrolling in the watch. It was a fine line for her to even be called Lady Angharade, though by not attaching the name of a holding, such as her Lostlin Hall, it could be considered that to call her a lady was merely a courtesy title. Besides, she had been invited by an alleged Lord Tando, so she was clearly not the only one using such a styling. "Then sleeping God watch over you, Tristan," Angharade told him. "Draw first, Trudiger," he easily returned. Was that a traditional Sacramontan blessing? She would commit it to memory, it had a rustic charm to it. They parted ways after a bend in the gardens, each taking the different side of a lightning-struck tree, and within moments she had lost sight of the grey-eyed man. Even knowing Tristan had once been a thief, she thought that his knack for disappearing into the background was rather impressive. Continuing down the garden path alone, Angharade greeted a few other guests wandering the opposite way as she came across them. merely polite greetings, not even introductions, as that would be improper before she had found her hosts. She lightly went down the last flight of stairs and headed for the pavilions, few eyes turning to her, though some did, and before she could even begin her search she was intercepted. The pair approached her together and she must admit that they were, at first glance, a humorous match. The man was a short, skinny Mulaney with flappy ears dragged down by too many golden earrings. Though his face was more plain than ugly, he had a large wart at the corner of his left eyebrow that drew the eye. The woman, by contrast, was as tall as she was corpulent. Aslan of look, though more tanned than either Tupac or Etsy had been, she had startlingly delicate features. Like a doll's face had been screwed atop a rounded waterskin. A second look, though, corrected the impressions. The Aslan, Captain Nanettle, she would guess, had the calluses of someone who had trained in the sort for years, and she moved with a fluidity belying her size. As for the likely Lord Tando, there was an intricate green tattoo on the side of neck whose pattern she dimly recognized. Those sharp geometric shapes within curving patterns were a mark of honor, an award given out by a Zinduna to those who had done a great house an even greater service. A man to be wary of, if he was her enemy. Lady Angharade, I presume? The Aslan woman asked with a smile. Her teeth were crooked, one broken, but her voice was smooth as honey. She was one of those fortunate souls blessed with a natural speaking voice. Indeed, Angharade replied, sketching out a short bow. Would I be speaking to Captain Nanettle? Nanettle Chapule, she confirmed. Captain of the 3rd Brigade. And by my side, I can introduce myself, Nanettle, the man snorted, then offered Angharade a bow. Lord Tando Fenya, at your service. It is always a pleasure to encounter a fellow Mulaney on these distant shores. A long history of having been given such compliments by Mulaney nobles allowed Angharade to keep her smile from going stiff. The man would not have meant any offense, even if any perduree worth their salt would have found it. Instead she tried to recall if she had ever heard of House Fenya but drew a blank. It was not a famous house, at least. The pleasure is mine, Angharade replied. I am as surprised as I am pleased by your invitation. The two shared a smirk. Your presence is not unexpected, Lord Tando amiably said. We make it a point to keep an eye for any promising recruits from the Isles. She doesn't know who you are, Tando, Captain Nanettle said, sounding amused. Your we must seem rather mysterious. I must confess I am somewhat at a loss, Angharade said. Only somewhat because she had been warned of the man's possible connections earlier. Ah, my apologies, Lord Tando said, yet smiled like a well-fed cat. House Fenya is not well known but you might have heard of the singing jackals. The noblewoman's brows rose. So Valentina's supposition had been accurate. I have, she said. The largest free company to take contracts on the Isles. The largest of all the free companies, some say, Lord Tando proudly told her. My uncle, Captain General Wella, leads it. My line has long been a source of high officers for the jackals, and it is our company's practice to recruit from Mainland first and foremost. There was great interest when your name came up, Lady Angharade. The perduree's face smoothed into a pleasant mask. Was she about to be shamed, outed as a fallen noble on her every first Parlamentary evening? The others had convinced her that this evening was not likely a trap laid by either of this pair, but she must remain wary. Wary enough to keep smiling even as she prepared for the knife. That is flattering, my lord, she said. Decease, Tando, you can try to poach her for your cabal on your own time, Captain Nanettle drawled. Most here in the playhouse will know more than they should, Lady Angharade, as many are from families whose blood runs black. I myself am the granddaughter of a brigadier from Lucerna, the closest watch fortress and the seat for this region's garrison administration. Though with the son of Lucerna's own marshal being a student, she cannot claim to be the best connected in that regard, Lord Tando added. He is not here tonight, Nanettle replied, a tad sharply. They were not allies in truth, Angharade decided, merely a pair that had chosen to pool their resources to arrange the evening. That was reassuring. If this was not a common front, it was less likely to be a vessel of ambitions not common, and Angharad had done nothing to earn hatred from the officers of a fortress she had never heard of before tonight. Her two hosts made conversation with her a little longer, but they had an obligation to entertain and soon took their leave. Before doing so, however, Lord Tando took her aside. "I am of the 11th Brigade," he told her. "Do come to us if you encounter any trouble at all, Lady Angharad. It would please our captain greatly to welcome you as one of us." Song had been entirely correct, it seemed. The open attempt at poaching from another cabal felt unseemly, but she reminded herself that to do so was not against the rules of sholomance. That it felt uncomplimentary might simply be her wariness of the man coloring her impression. Angharad wasted no time after that in heading towards the tables, for her throat was parched and in truth she could do with a nibble. Besides, Song had asked her to learn what she could about other cables, and it was easier to approach strangers around such gathering places. Before she could so much as consider a drink, however, she was stopped by the sight of a familiar face. Lady Ferranda Vilazar, her hair pulled in the usual bun that did no favors to her strong chin, stood there in a tailored formal uniform as she picked out a cup of wine. "Ferranda," Angharad called out, surprised. The Infanzona turned in surprise, a smile lighting up her face when they recognized each other. "Angharad!" she exclaimed. "I had not heard your ship arrived. This is a most pleasant surprise." "We docked but a few hours ago," Angharad replied. "Just in time, then," Ferranda said. "This evening has been on the cards for weeks, you would have lost out in missing it. All the leading brigades have people here, and I expect there will be much wheeling and dealing over drinks." She snatched up a cup, offering it with a questioning look. Angharad took it. By the smell it was red wine. The dark-skinned noblewoman cocked an eyebrow. "Are you then here to intrigue as well, Captain Ferranda?" she teased. "I guess, but Ferranda Vilazar was sponsored by the Academy and so likely the leader of her cabal." The Infanzona laughed and did not deny the title. "A confirmation. We are rather beneath their notice, at least for now," she said. "Most brigades past 30 are latecomers, the chaff of this harvest. We are close, as the 31st Brigade, but still in the range." A raised eyebrow was directed Angharad's way. "What plaque did you end up ordering, anyhow?" "We did not order," the Perduri said. "We claimed 13th Brigade." Ferranda winced. "My condolences," she said. "Is the number truly so unlucky?" Angharad asked, reluctantly amused. "You are not the first to react this way." 13 years, emperors and treacheries, the Infanzona quoted. "There is no luck worse than—" She was interrupted and half bowled over by a tall man in a formal uniform, who Angharad found as familiar after a heartbeat. "Farah, you will not believe who I just ran into. Tristan is here. A rascal, I mean, not the man from the 44th. Lord Zenzel Duma was openly enthused as he recounted this, a look at odds with the grimness of his face. There was thick scar where he'd lost his eye, though the hollow was not empty, a rounded metal eye filled it, skillfully painted over. Only it was not in the warm brown of the Milani Lord's own gaze but an eerie pale that Angharad would not soon forget. It was the color of Tupac Sickle's eyes, after all. "Oh, apologies," Zenzel began when he realized he had interrupted. "I am, Lady Angharad?" "That would make two of us," Angharad really replied. He laughed, even as Ferranda rolled her eyes, and offered his arm to clasp. Angharad did, mood much improved by the warm reception. She had not known where they would stand, once the common threats of the Dominion no longer hung over their heads. "A most welcome surprise," Zenzel said, then leaned it. "I do not suppose you could tell me why the first words out of Tristan's mouth were a question about the provenance of the grilled cutlets?" The Perduri paused. The silence stretched and she was forced to smile embarrassedly. "I fear not," Angharad said. The pair traded a knowing look. "Still underfoot, then," Ferranda said. "As was to be expected." "Well, he is a Cryptia student," Zenzel replied. "We can't all be good upstanding laurels like you," the Infanzona teased. "You are to be of the Arthashastra Society, then," Angharad said. I did not think to ask before you left Three Pines. I am, the nobleman replied, reaching for a drink. Diplomat track, though our patron tells me the distinction grows muddled here on Terra. Ironic. All three of them turned towards the source of the word. A Mulaney, Angharad saw, and one who had high birth stamped on his bearing. The stranger was tall and lithely muscled, braids going down halfway to his back and his uniform barely cousin to what it must have once been. His black overcoat was made loose and without buttons until the waist, wide open and revealing a thin red silk shirt that bared a slender stripe of skin down to slightly above his navel. He wore a silken half-cape and a blade at his hip. A lovely saber, and though somewhat ornate, Angharad noted the leather grip was worn. "I beg your pardon?" Ferranda asked. "It is ironic," the man smiled, "for the likes of this one to believe he could ever be a diplomat." Zenzel frowned. "I do not know you," he said. "What I have done to earn such words?" "I am Lord Musa Change," the man sneered. "That name will mean nothing to you, but this should help. My mother is sister to the mother of Lady Arifa Sandhill." Angharad had only heard that name once, but even had she not clearly recalled it the way Zenzel still would have told her who was being spoken of. The other half of the arranged marriage he had fled from, the one with a daughter of the proverbially wealthy House Sandhill. "Yes, that Arifa," Lord Musa coldly said, the reaction not escaping his notice. "You broke the heart of my favorite cousin, Duma. Shamed her in the eyes of every lady in Malin by running off with some whore instead of wedding her as was your duty." Zenzel was a fair fighter with sword and pistol, Angharad knew, but she had never considered him a threat. It was not without reason the man had gone into a scholarly covenant. The look that came to his face when Diantha was called a whore almost had her reconsider that opinion, searing hatred, like closing a fist around hot coals. It was the look of a man who would make it slow. "So you are a dog of House Sandhill," Zenzel disdainfully said. "That explains the manners. I would return your insult, but even dog would be a compliment to the likes of you," Lord Musa said scornfully. "I see at least your strumpet did not even make it to Shalomance, though what else could be expected of a bedwarmer? But it offends me to see you walking about as if you belong here." The Mulaney noble leaned forward. "This is an evening for honorable company, Zenzel Duma," he sneered. "By what right do you attend?" The altercation had already begun drawing eyes to them. Other guests turned to watch, some even drifting closer, but Lord Musa did not seem to mind. "It is not for you to decide who attends the evenings of others, Mulaney," Ferranda coldly said. "It is not for the Sacramontan to speak when real nobles converse," Lord Musa dismissed. Lady Ferranda's hand drifted to her rapier, which the man noticed with a smirk. As if daring her to draw, Angharad thought. Musa Change's words and actions were not dishonorable, for he was avenging the slight on a kinswoman's honor, but they were needlessly provocative. He did not speak like a man who was seeking resolution, he was picking a fight. Not that he would have the time to get into one, Angharad noted as she watched who was approaching from the corner of her eye. "And what appears to be the trouble here?" The host made their appearance. Captain Nanettle, who had been the one to speak, seemed irate. Lord Tando's face was but a pleasant mask, in mood, if not in looks. "You let an anar Norlas cur, Tando," Lord Musa said, ignoring the Aslan entirely. "An honest mistake, I am sure, but it need be remedied." "That is a grave accusation," Lord Tando said. "What has you make it?" "It does not matter," Captain Nanettle sharply interrupted. "No trouble is to be allowed on playhouse grounds." "Is honor trouble to you, Nanettle?" Lord Tando lightly asked. The glare she turned on her fellow host was dark indeed, and in a heartbeat Angharad made out the whole shape of this. She had seen that game unfold a dozen times before, after all, just outside dueling grounds when noble children gathered for games almost as pointed. Lord Tando had not arranged for this, but now that it was happening he was weighing the benefits and choosing accordingly. Which was worth more, the favor of his Lord Musa, or of Zenzel's cabal? Captain Nanettle evidently saw nothing to gain in allowing this at all and was glaring at the man with heat, but she was only half the house. She could not put an end to this if she stood alone. and as Lord Musa Change raised his voice to tell the other guests of Zenzel's misdeeds, her old companion defending himself as best he could, calling Musa a thuggish fool, the old matter of indifference to rooks, Angharad knew that a duel was in the making. Lord Musa had pushed hard for it and would not give up. Reckless, she thought, only half listening to the public argument. He provoked Faranda as well, as if the fight matters more than who he is to be fighting. But why is he so sure he will win? It was when Lord Musa turned to address guests up in the garden, half-cape fluttering, that Angharad found her answer. Hidden away under the silken cloth, she had glimpsed a sheath. A parrying sword, she realized. Musa Change was a duelist. That was why he thought victory certain, and Angharad was not sure he was wrong. The noblewoman hesitated. A lesser noble's place was not to meddle in the conflicts of great lords, she had always known that. Yet Zenzel was no great lord, Lord Musa neither, and this was not Malin. Yet Angharad did not speak only for herself, she was part of the cabal, and to intervene. If you cannot make friends, make an impression, Song had tasked her. Would it not be doing both, to lend these two a hand? The warmth of their greeting was no reason to act, she knew that, but surely this could be considered a strategic decision. Surely, she repeated, setting down the cup of wine she had yet to touch and leaning towards Faranda. Bait, Angharad whispered. The man is a duelist. The Infanzona's eyes narrowed. Certain. The Perduri nodded and the other woman cursed. He wants to kill Zenzel's reputation, Faranda guessed. Right from the start. Make him a pariah with Milani for the rest of our time here. It occasionally served to remember that for all that House Vilazar had been minor nobility, Faranda had been raised to be its lady and been familiar with the likes of better-born men like the Sheridan brothers long before they came together to the Dominion. She was no fool, for all her lack of dutifulness, and hardly blind. He wants a fight, Angharad agreed. And will get one. The Infanzona's jaw tightened. I cannot ask you to, you forget, she cut in, who that Sandal coin was spent on. Before Faranda could answer she stepped away, idly coming to stand before the still awaiting lord. Musa Change frowned at her interruption. Stepassi, you claim, Angharad said, to speak for House Sandal? I do, Lord Musa replied. By virtue of shared blood. Good, she nodded. Then we have matters of honor to settle. Zenzel, who had been watching her with surprise, caught on first. Lady Angharad, he stiffly said. I can settle this myself. Then do so when I am finished with him, Angharad mildly replied, matching Musa's gaze. An assassin in Sandal employ poisoned me and attempted to murder me in my bed, Musa Change. If you carry that house's honor on Talamanterra, I call you now to answer on their behalf. Lord Musa laughed. Found another girl to trick, Duma. He mocked, eyes flicking Zenzel's way. You must be halfway decent in bed if she's willing to die for you. The noblewoman's face tightened. It was, unfortunately, still too early in the process to slap him across the face. My name, she said, is Angharad Tredigger. Insult me again and I will not consider honor satisfied with first blood. Musa eyed her with an insolent smile. That accent, Perduri, is it? I thought I smelled rotten fish and mediocrity. There's the mystery solved. As for first blood. The Milani pulled back his overcoat's loose right sleeve, revealing 3 black lines tattooed on his arm with the first beginning at the wrist. There were murmurs in the crowd, for Lord Musa had just revealed he was not simply a duelist but 3 duels deep into becoming a swordmaster. Perhaps it is you that should worry of that, Tredigger. Trot along now. Only he did not get the answer he had expected, for Zenzel let out a quiet laugh and answered Faranda's quiet question with a nod as Angharad herself began to unbutton her jacket. She would have dropped it on the ground, but a passing servant took it up instead and folded it neatly. Praiseworthy service. Without a word, she rolled up the left sleeve of her white undershirt. 10 silver lines were bared, the last at her elbow. Lord Musa Change went still. Let us have an exchange, Musa, Angharad calmly said. In deference to your inexperience I would offer to use my left hand, but I am as able with it as my right. So how am I to make this sporting, I wonder? Her gaze cast around the tables, past the bottles and glasses and the dishes. There was a cutting knife by the roast she considered, but right besides it was what would cut deepest. Angharad took a step towards the table and deftly took out a butter knife, wiping it clean against the edge of the butter dish before turning back to her opponent. There were a few laughs and much excited conversation. Lord Musa went red-faced. "You dare," he hissed. "What are you complaining about, change?" she said. "I am to use the tool for its stated purpose, cutting through butter." It was too much of a provocation. The man drew his blade, a single-edged saber like hers, then revealed his offhand. The traditional parrying blade for dueling, which meant he was a classical Milani fencer. The kind of opponent she was most familiar with facing. Angharad untied her sheathed saber from her hip and tossed it at the man's feet, adding the insult of throwing the blade as well as the sheath when requesting a duel. It had the implication she believed herself capable of killing him with what she yet held, in this case a butter knife. And more than that, Lord Musa, having pulled ahead of the formalities and the throes of his anger, was forced to sheathe his saber back to be able to undo his parrying blade's sheath and toss it at her feet. The fumbling earned him some unkind laughter from the crowd, further reddening his cheeks. "First blood or surrender," Angharad stated. "Let us hope you will last at least 2 passes, after all that strutting." "You will have no mercy of me," Musa snarled. Angharad loosened her stance, widening it and pointing down the butter knife. Even for a duel to first blood it would have been arrogance on her part to take up the particular armament, if not for one thing. The Milani raised his blade and Angharad glimpsed. 3 steps, she finted for the side and he stepped in to hit her forehead with his own. She breathed out. Talent school, then, only they were so eager to throw hands during blade work. 3 steps, she finted to the side. When he stepped in she moved quicker, kicked out his knee. He struck up, cutting into her flank with a parrying blade as her knife slid on the coat. Thick cloth, she thought, the butter knife would not bite at all unless the angle was just right. But she had seen enough to act. Angharad raised her weapon, and as Lord Musa sneered she stepped forward. 1 step, 2, 3, feint to the right. Fluidly, like a snake striking, Musa snapped forward. But her polished boot was already moving, kicking out his knee under him. Half a stumble forward, the angle spun off, and his left hand struck, only Angharad had stepped aside, caught the wrist of his saber hand and without batting an eye bent the arm behind his back. Lord Musa shouted in pain and surprise, forced down to his knee, and Angharad aimed the blow perfectly. The thin point of the butter knife went right through the seams of the coat, into flesh. "No," the Milani rasped out. "How?" Angharad's fingers tightened around the butter knife and she ripped it out of his shoulder. The man screamed, blood spurting out and splashing his coat. She stepped away before she could be stained, flicking the blood off the dull blade as stumbled back up to his feet. She looked him up and down as he took a fearful step back, his hand on the spurting shoulder. "Go clean yourself up, Musa," Angharad said. A nobleman should have standards. She had not aimed for an artery so he should live. If he was lucky, he might even keep most the range of motion with the arm. He pulled back, as if wanting to flee but too ashamed to give way publicly. "And one last thing," she called, stopping him in his tracks. "Should you ever again imply I am my friend's bedwarmer, the ensuing first blood will be a blade halfway through your brains. Not if you understand, Musa." The look he shot her had brimstone enough to rival pandemonium, but he was too fearful of the wound bleeding him dry to draw this out. Musa nodded, gritting his teeth. "Good boy," she thinly smiled. "You may leave, now. This will not be the end of it, Tredegar," he snarled. "The 9th Brigade will have answer. I shall endeavor to find a larger butter dish, then," she shrugged. He looked as if she had slapped him across the face. Arguably it would have been kinder on her part to do so. Angharad was no great wit, but Victoria made derision easy to even the clumsiest of tongues. And as Lord Musa slunk away like a whipped dog to get his shoulder looked at, it was as if the entire crowd exhaled. Noise erupted, not the uncouth clamor of a mob but the contained excitement of good society at the aftermath of a spectacle. When she turned to face her acquaintances, Zenzel's face was resigned, and Firanda's unreadable. Angharade hesitated, now considering she might have pushed the matter further than either desired. It had been in their name, not hers, but... She was interrupted by their approach. "Thank you," Zenzel quietly said. "But I'm afraid I might have dragged you into greater trouble than you know." She raised an eyebrow. "Is there something unusual about this 9th Brigade?" she asked. "Its captain is Sebastian Cameron," Firanda said. "He is the son of Lucerna's marshal. I have heard that Lucerna is near this island, and of some importance in the watch," Angharade acknowledged. "But he is only a student while at Cholomance, surely." Zenzel leaned closer. "Around a quarter of the soldiers garrisoning the island was transferred from Lucerna," he whispered. "And much of the supplies coming to Port Elysée first go through there." Angharade's eyes narrowed. She understood that family came first, but what they suggested sounded rather beyond the acceptable lines. "I doubt either of us could have beaten a fledgling swordmaster," Firanda said. "You have my deepest thanks for your intervention, and our hand in friendship twice over. Yet I would not be offended if you made peace with the 9th, Angharade. I want to make this clear. Our troubles need not be yours. Song is captain, so that is not my decision to make," Angharade admitted, then flicked a glance at the stairs Lord Musa had fled up. "Yet I see no need to make apologies to a man who implied me a whore and insulted the duchy of my birth. If not for the rules of Cholomance, I might well have killed him." She had never killed in an honor duel back in Malin, but had she been given such strong insults she might well have done so. "He did come on strong, didn't he?" Zenzel mused. "Knew the rules about killing and so thought himself beyond consequence, I imagine. We will all need to learn the lay of this place. Neither would hear of parting ways after this. And so when she began the rounds it was with the help of the pair to make introductions. It was a whirlwind of names and faces, most of which were excited to speak about the duel and gossip, but nothing more serious. Angharade was not overwhelmed. It was little different from being introduced to any other social circle, though instead of a cousin or an aunt it was Zenzel and Firanda who made the introductions. She did not learn much of use, in truth, save that the captain of the 49th Brigade, a tall Tianxi, was insistently curious about who else was part of the 13th Brigade. Suspecting enmity for Song, she avoided the matter and turned the questions around until he left in open irritation. She encountered her hosts again, naturally. Lord Tando found cool reception from all three of them, and gracefully excused himself. He knew the ways of this game and that his choice would have consequences before making it. Captain Ninettle, on the other hand, found better welcome, and she herself was noticeably friendlier than when she had first met with Angharade. It soon became evident why. "I expect dear old Sebastian will be on your backs about this," Ninettle idly said. "He always has been, if you'll forgive my language, a right prick." All three facing the Aslan captain were highborn, so the picture was not difficult for either to paint. Ninettle Chapule, whose grandfather was a powerful officer in Lucerna, saw the captain of the 9th Brigade's even more powerful connections there as an inconvenience. It would be best for her if he were sidelined, perhaps even recalled, and she came to hold the greatest influence over the Lucernan contingent. Captain Ninettle seemed quite interested in making ties with those who might oppose her rival, and though all knew better than to commit to anything, the conversation was promisingly friendly. Perhaps a dinner would soon be organized. Once they parted ways, Angharade realized with a start that she was smiling. Not at how the night had gone, though it had gone well enough to her eye, but because she felt at ease, comfortable. The faces and the rules were not the same, but she knew this place. This kind of night. It was almost like coming home, in a way, and it would have been a lie to say she was not enjoying herself. If not for the black everywhere, she might think she had never left Parader. It occurred to her then she had not seen Tristan in at least an hour, but a look around yielded no trace of her comrade. Had he already left? Most likely he had, ever underfoot as Firanda said. There was no need to feel guilty. Still, she excused herself from the other two so she might claim a new drink and perhaps have another look around for the Sacramontan. Only within a moment of taking her first sip of some pale cup of wine, Angharad was approached. "Ah, the heroine of the hour is all alone. I must take advantage." She turned at the words, and then paused to take in the sight. The stranger was nearly as tall as Angharad herself, though narrower at the shoulders and not as strongly built. She was, however, blessed with a full figure that the cut of her uniform made evident. She wore the same kind of collared, knee-length tunic as Mariam, but it was tailored to flatter, and instead of buttons a very narrow open oval beneath the collar dipped almost down to her sternum. It did not reveal anything save a stripe of smooth, dark skin, but hinted at much. Fitted black trousers and slender boots matched the black of the stranger's tunic, though there were red accents on the side of the trousers, and her belt was a length of intricate colored beads. She wore not a cloak but a velvet capelet, and the golden bangles around her wrists clattered together with a pleasant tinkling sound as she offered her hand. "Captain Imani Langa," she smiled. Angharad took the delicate fingers, bowed and pressed a soft kiss against the knuckle. When she straightened it was to find Captain Imani's smile had broadened. "Lady Angharad Tredegar," she replied. "The pleasure is all mine." "A bold claim, after the entertainment you have just provided," Imani laughed. "It is a rare thing to see even a fledgling swordmaster made such thorough sport of." The accent was feigned, but grew distinct the more the other woman spoke. "Euthugil," Angharad decided. Imani Langa was from the Low Isle, and being raised speaking the Mateb dialect had left her with an accent in the Amoa they now spoke. "I was blessed with a thorough education," Angharad simply replied, then paused. "Would I be wrong in believing you of the Low Isle?" "Sharp of you." "Only on my father's side, as it happens, though I was raised in a hold near the border," Captain Imani said. "I must compliment you on the lightness of your own accent, though those pretty silver lines on your arm rather reveal your own provenance. Only Perdiri could become mirror dancers, though in truth Angharad did not know if this was ancient law or merely custom. Euthukil and Peredur felt like different ends of the world, once, but now the distance feels almost petty, Angharad mused. "No matter how far, we islanders will bring our bickering with us," Captain Imani dryly replied. "Why, only yesterday." She had a most mysterious smile, Angharad thought, but she was prevented from further pondering it when a servant apologized for interrupting them and presented her with a folded letter. "From your Sacramantan friend," the servant said. "Apologies again, ladies." "It is nothing," Captain Imani dismissed. Angharad unfolded the paper, finding an ungainly scrawl in Antigua waiting for her. "Imani had eye on you since you talked with Hos. Careful. Feranda is liked, good ally. Avoid 49th, enemies. Am following lead, don't know when back." Hiding her surprise, Angharad folded the paper anew and tucked it away as she replied in kind to Imani's smile. Some details she filed away, Feranda's popularity and that the 49th would have to be disposed of, for these could be addressed later. The first detail was the most concerning. There were many reasons she might have drawn Imani Langa's eye earlier, and while some of them rather flattering others were rather more dangerous. After a little more conversation the other woman suggested they go for a walk in the garden ring, Angharad's stomach tightening in dismay as the balance settled in favor of Sinister. She could not even enjoy walking arm in arm in a field of flowers, bodies brushing together, for she had to be wary of contract and poison. With an inviting smile Amandi led her past a crumbling wall, out of sight, but Angharad knew this would not end in soft kisses and wandering hands. She kept her body from tensing, for it would give away that she knew the attempt was coming, but was wondering how to explain having fought twice in one evening when the other woman's hand rose towards the neckline of her bare skin of her tunic, fingers reaching for something. "Daughter of the Isles, you are called to service," Captain Amandi said. And from the generous cut of her uniform she produced not a knife but a small copper coin, pressing it into Angharad's hand. No, not copper. It was wood, only polished and lacquered. On one side was carved a helmet turtle's shell, on the other a slender crown. Angharad knew of only one wood that kept so vivid a color without needing to be painted. This was Malani ironwood. Too precious a thing to be wasted on a token, unless you were in the service of Malin itself. Angharad swallowed dryly. "You are enough ado," she breathed out, and immediately felt like sinking into a hole. It was one thing to call an agent of the left-hand house a turtle behind their back, the jokes about their emblem well worn in every corner of the Isles, but the High Queen's private hunting hounds were not for the likes of her to disrespect. Even the highest of the Azinduna feared their knives and neck for digging up the most deeply buried of secrets. Lady Amandi, thankfully, did not seem offended by the foolishness Angharad had blurted out. "I am a finger of the left hand," Amandi acknowledged. "The house has tasked me with passing to you a message, and with it an offer." Angharad's jaw clenched. What was it that the same court that had struck House Tredegar from its rolls now had to say to her? Her perpetual majesty did not condone the killing of Lady Anwar Marer, whom she yet remembers fondly, Lady Amandi said. Circumstance forced the disgrace of House Tredegar, but those whose hand was at work on that night are even now being hunted. Angharad stilled. She could not have said whether she was starkly, deeply relieved or the most furious she had ever been in her life. "A prisoner was taken at Lun Hall," Lady Amandi said. "We know their name. The soldiers who slew your house are known to us as well. Hired men." "What?" Angharad slowly said, forcing her tone not to waver. "Do you want?" "There is an object on Talamanterra that is the rightful property of the High Queen," the dark-eyed beauty said. "The left-hand house asks that you retrieve it on our behalf and deliver it to my hands." The Perduri's eyes narrowed. "You are on Talamanterra as well," Angharad said. "Why would you need me?" "Because," Lady Amandi amiably smiled, "I am not a mirror dancer whose watch connections make above suspicion." Meaning it was hidden somewhere dangerous and the watch would be on the lookout for movement around it. A fool's bargain by any fair measure. And yet a survivor. A cousin, she wondered, a servant? Sleeping god, just knowing she was not the last. All that in a trail she would be able to follow when she returned to Malin. The left-hand house was playing her, and only a fool would let them. Was Angharad a fool? "Think on it," Lady Amandi said. "And when you decide, come find me." "Where?" she croaked out. "The Emerald Vaults, room 17, Amandi said. The dark-eyed beauty stepped away, yet smiling. "I will be expecting you." "Am I a fool?" Angharad wondered, watching the other woman walk away. And she dreaded the answer not because she did not know, but because deep down she already did. She was, and it was no choice at all. Told continued. Thanks for listening.